Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails special summer series, curated by the Rails section editors. During the weeks of July 19th and July 26th, we're celebrating the sections that make up the Brooklyn Rail, which you can find in print and on our website, free and accessible to all. Our conversations this week will celebrate the editorial diversity covered in the Rail and here in our virtual events. I'm Joseph Salvatore, the books editor at the Rail, and I've been books editor for the past 8 years. One of my favorite aspects of editing the books section is working with the writers. As much as I enjoy bringing the news of books to our readers, it is really the chance to work with writers as they think through their ideas about books, challenge themselves to dig deeper, and to bring the fullest argument they can about a book to our pages and to our readers. For me, that's one of the most satisfying aspects of it. And it's something I look forward to every month. It's hard work, not only for myself, of course, but for the writers indeed. But it's something that is such a pleasure. Today, I have the privilege of hosting 5 of our book critics, some who are a little bit more regular than others, but all of whom have contributed to our pages in the past. I'm going to introduce all of them in alphabetical order, and then we'll begin our conversation. Our first critic is John Domini. John Domini's been regularly reviewing books for us for many years, and he writes not only for the Rail, but his criticism has also appeared in LitHub and the Washington Post and elsewhere. He has journalism in the New York Times. And as for his fiction, he is a writer, and Salman Rushdie praised his 2019 novel, The Color Inside a Melon, as both elegant and hard-boiled and absorbing. John Domini lives in Iowa with his wife, the science fiction writer Letty Prell, and we'll hear more from him in a little bit. Our next reviewer is Yvonne C Garrett. She is a writer, feminist, editor, teacher, and archivist. And she holds an MLIS and an MFA in fiction, 2 master's degrees from NYU, and a PhD with a dissertation that focused on women in punk rock. She's been published in a wide array of journals and magazines, and has published 5 poetry chapbooks. She's a senior fiction editor at Black Lawrence Press, and she also edits the weekly publishing newsletter, Sapling. After that, we have Tony Luisi, poet and critic and art maker. Tony is the author of many books of poems, including Radiant Losses, The Burning Door, Meditation, Archipelago, and a wonderful book of interviews with 20 American authors published by Boa Editions called Passwords Primeval. Tony's received numerous teaching awards, and he writes regularly for the book section at the Brooklyn Rail, where he covers mostly poetry for us, and his interviews and criticism have also been published in the American Literary Review, Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. Next, we have Tanjil Rashid. He's a freelance writer and producer who works in television, makes documentaries and current affairs programs. He's also a freelance writer who regularly contributes to The Guardian, The Times, The Financial Times, The Spectator, the BBC, and we're so lucky, the Brooklyn Rail. He lives in London. And finally, we have Andrea Scrima. Andrea is the author of A Lesser Day, and she has, her work has several, I'm sorry, I just messed up reading this. She is the recipient of Writers' Fellowships from the Berlin Senate for Cultural Affairs, and writes a monthly column for 3 Quarks Daily. She is the editor-in-chief of the online literary magazine Statarec, and we'll be hearing more from Andrea in a moment. So I really want to welcome all of you and thank you so much for participating in today's conversation. I thought I would ask everybody a kind of set a few general questions to get us started in our conversation, and then hope that it turns into a conversation. And I'm going to ask everybody just to come in and respond to others, and we'll see how that all goes today. I want to start by asking each of you, if you wouldn't mind, to talk a little bit about how you got started in book criticism. I mean, how did you get into this business, and how did you learn to actually, is there a craft of book reviewing? If so, how did you learn it? And why, importantly, why did you want to take on the chore of book criticism? John, could I ask you to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Hello, everybody. Thank you. It's interesting you asked me this question about where we got started, since my guess is I got started a long time before anyone else here, the oldest on the panel. That said, I think my primary answer for why I do it is that it's something in the DNA. I feel fulfilled and both challenged and fulfilled by book reviewing criticism in a way that not everybody would be. I know there are fiction writers like myself who stay a long way from it. I like it, I seek it out. I'm very happy to produce things regularly for the Rail. But I do have a book of selected criticism, and here it is. And in there, in the introduction, I say it's the way the helix doubles. It's just something in my DNA. I can also add that at the beginning, I was very lucky to work in a couple of exciting places, but most particularly a kind of Brooklyn Rail of the late 70s in Boston, for what it's worth, the punk era. And Yvonne, if you don't know, the Boston Phoenix, the place I'm talking about, had excellent coverage of punk, and among its early writers on music, I believe my memory is correct, was Susan Orlean. She certainly worked for the Phoenix, and I would see her at punk shows. I just kept on doing it, and there were times I felt I had an impact. What I said about Gilbert Sorrentino in The Believer, what I said about Jamie Gordon in Plowshares, I thought that had some impact, moved the culture a bit, a wee bit. And I don't want to go on too much longer, but I felt it worked. It's an item. It's something that worked. It worked for me, and it's an item of pride for me. But I'm going to end on this point as somebody with a fairly long experience in book reviewing. I would argue now, perhaps contrary to others on the panel, and definitely contrary to other writers I see in social media, that right now we're living in a moment that's very good for literary criticism. It's almost a golden era of literary criticism with so many venues, and even this new thing called Substack on Twitter, which I haven't ventured into. Well, I know of it through Twitter. I link through Twitter. That this is an extraordinary era for criticism, and the Rail is a part of that. The Rail is advancing the art of book reviewing and its impact as part of this great new era. We can talk about that as we go on.
John, thank you. I'm going to move on to Yvonne in a second, but I want to ask everybody to keep in mind this notion that John mentioned of the golden age of book reviewing and the multiplicity of places we have now. Because I want to talk, one of the things I wanted to get to later is this idea of like Goodreads and Amazon reviews and where this all kind of fits in on a continuum, perhaps. John, thanks for that. Yvonne, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Hi, I'm going to attempt to be brief, which, as Joe knows, is very difficult for me. I want to follow John's lead in thanking the Rail for this space and this, this opportunity to speak about this thing that I do that a lot of my friends don't understand because it doesn't make a lot of money. Not to say that that's important to my friends, but I also want to kind of reference something that John said about the 1970s punk era. I'm a little bit younger. I grew up in the late 70s, 80s punk era. And, I came at writing any kind of criticism through the fanzine world. And I was a rock critic until I became a successful enough music publicist that I really saw an ethical issue there, that I couldn't be publicizing the same bands that I was writing about in places like Thrasher and, excuse me, losing my voice, and Cream and all those kind of places. I was a columnist for Alternative Press magazine in its early days. And that's kind of where I shaped this way that I sort of write in the Rail. Other book criticism that I do is much more staid, it's much more professional, or there are, for instance, for Publishers Weekly, you have a strict word count, and your first line and your last line have to make a specific point. The Rail provides a really important space for conversation around literature. And as I have done probably since I could walk, I come at any piece of art with that catchword, critical eye, critical theory, as a feminist. So if you hand me a book, I'm going to tell you what works from a craft perspective, from an art perspective, but I'm also going to tell you, really importantly, what's happening with gender, what's happening with race, what's happening with the conversations here, what does the author mean when we say we or us? And the Rail provides that space. When I write a review, how did I get started? What have I learned, and why? Why is a really important question here for me. I don't write book reviews because I get paid a lot of money for it. I write book reviews because that's not the case, as we all know. I write book reviews because I think it's important to provide a space for marginalized work, or provide a space of critiquing work by authors who are just taken as great. This book is great because it's written by so-and-so. My mom, I'm sorry if I'm a bit scattered. I just came on the red eye back from Northern Arizona, so I'm a little fried. But that said, my mom handed me an essay not too long ago that I wrote, I don't know in what grade, probably 5th grade, on why I don't like Hemingway. And Joe's gonna laugh because, from the craft perspective, yes, Hemingway. But why, I think the work I do in the Rail is to talk about why do we have these mythic figures, and why is this writer maybe just as important? If you look at my track record with the Rail, there's a lot of women writers, there's some queer writers, there's some people who are trying to do different things with the language, or with, my beloved fiction. I'm also a fiction writer. So I learn a lot about the way I can write, the way I can express myself by turning a critical eye on other people's work. I also learn a lot, and some might say this is, and again, an ethical quandary. I am the fiction editor at a medium-sized independent press, but I would never review anything. Of course, I never pitch anything that we publish at Black Lawrence, but it helps me look at manuscripts. All these hundreds of books that I read and review, it's just a way to look at fiction. It's a way to approach fiction. And I think that's all of the questions that I was supposed to answer.
Thank you. Absolutely. I want to come back to so many of the things you said, and that may have activated some other folks to want to jump in too. But for the sake of this little round, why don't I ask if Tony would come in on some of this? Tony, talk to us a little bit about your origins.
You can hear me, okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Joe. And I'm really privileged to be able to write for the Rail with writers as great as yourselves in this panel. I'm really flattered to be here. How I started getting into book reviewing and why I was drawn to it, I guess that could be a very long answer. And it would, I think, hearing all of you talk for an hour each on that would be something of interest to me. I mean, it's one of those questions that we could go on and on about that. But I'll just say that I started reviewing in the early 90s for a very academic little publication called the Bulletin of Bibliography back when I was in graduate school. And after that, when I moved to Rochester, I wrote very much a lot for the queer press on LGBTQ issues, and that was really something I enjoyed doing for a long time. But I always viewed my poetry enthusiasms as separate from that, and I'm not sure why. It was Joe who asked me, based on my track record with interviews and so forth, if I wanted to start writing for the Rail, and that was something I really did want to do. I've always been drawn to the book review. I've always been drawn to criticism. But what draws me to criticism isn't necessarily the same thing as what makes me drawn to writing book reviews. For example, one of my favorite pieces of criticism is Mark Twain's The Literary Offenses of Fenimore Cooper, which I think is hilarious and just vicious. But also something a little bit more penetrating would be something like D.H. Lawrence's assessment of Walt Whitman, something like that, where I'm really intrigued by how how someone could honor the poet, but also get at some of the limitations of the poet. For me, though, my major reason for wanting to review is a question of intimacy and habitation. I love literature, and it's just one more way I could get closer to what I love. So if you look at my track record as a reviewer, I'm generally reviewing things that I actually like a lot. And if I am given an assignment, I do ask Joe, could I look at the book? If I don't like it, can I reserve the right to give it back to you? Because I really, I don't mind steeping myself in something I don't understand, but I have to be able to respect and to generally come to an intimate place with it. So for me, it's a kind of way of being in the world. Forming relationships with a book is kind of like forming relationships with people. And for me, that's really why I do it. And so each review I write is a labor of love. And it is, I spend an inordinate amount of time on writing each review and shaping what comes into it, sometimes to better effect than others. But I can tell you that when I'm done, I feel like I've really gotten to know that book pretty well. And that's important to me.
Good stuff. Tony, thank you so much. You and I have talked on the phone, and I've talked on the phone with others sometimes when there's a crisis of faith during the process. And I'm glad you mentioned, this chance to kind of pass on a book if you've examined it and felt that it's not right. It leads to one of the questions that I wanted to ask everybody, and it's the inevitable one that we may have some time to get to, about, the difference between dealing with a book critically, if we're thinking of it in part of this larger conversation, and the negative review and how we deal with that. Because all of you, most of you have reviewed books fairly strongly for me, and we've talked sometimes about those arguments, and usually they've stayed in the final published piece. So, all right, Tony, thanks so much. I want to ask Tanjil to share some of your thoughts about this.
Yes. So, how did I get started in book reviewing? Well, maybe the better question is why. Why on earth did I do this? Why do I spend my time reviewing books? It's a difficult question. I think I always loved reading literary criticism. I mean, it's ever since my father used to come home, with a newspaper, or at the weekend, and I would turn immediately to the book section. And so I got most of my education probably from reading literary criticism, book reviews in newspapers, and then, graduated to magazines and journals. And then essentially I, did a university degree in criticism, which is what the study of literature, essentially becomes. And then I just sort of stuck at it. Now it's for me, it's not a profession. I have a day job, like most people nowadays who write book reviews. I work in TV, making all sorts of sort of rubbish, to be perfectly honest. But what I really love doing is writing the book reviews, in my spare time. And I'm really delighted to be, reading books and thinking about them. And it's my sort of relief from the banality of, how I actually earn my living. And any money I get from my criticism, I just feel sort of grateful that someone pays me to pursue my hobby, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering, when you talked about being a young person looking at book reviews, and being also a trained critic, do the approaches differ? As a reader of book reviews, you understand the form because of your personal interest in it, but you're also trained to be a critic. Do you ever sort of how do you negotiate the difference between a kind of academic approach to a book, Tanjil, and that more personal conversation, say, with another reader?
I think I've always favoured the latter approach. I mean, even when I was at university, I think I struggled to really see things in a properly academic and rigorous way, which seemed a bit more boring. That's not to say I don't respect a lot of brilliant academics. People I was reading at the time, people like Frank Kermode and Tony Tanner and people like that. But my style was always a bit more journalistic, and I suppose maybe I had in mind some version of my younger self, reading the newspaper as a teenager, trying to learn about the world, and maybe that's part of the job of the critic, to sort of spread the word and to educate in some way and entertain, which maybe academics are a bit less conscious of. So I like to put sort of jokes and be sarcastic or whatever. Sometimes people seem to sort of be more inclined to read you if you do that. And yeah, I like that. And my favorite critics were really people who existed, who had a much larger readership than their scholarly peers. And sometimes these were academics. I mean, people like Lionel Trilling or whatever, of course, had his perch, but at the same time, was talking to a vast audience. And that's kind of what I miss about a certain idea of criticism that was maybe more central to the culture in the past, which is the idea of a critic who doesn't just write about literature, but writes about everything, and criticism is almost a sort of a way of being in the world, rather than just a sort of subject specialist in certain kinds of books.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The Elizabeth Hardwicks, the Updikes, and oh God, so many others.
Roland Barthes.
Of course. Yeah, right. Tanjil, thank you. Andrea, would you come in on this? Tell us a little bit about your backgrounds in this.
Well, let me think, where should I begin? The Brooklyn Rail, it will always have this very special place in my heart, because it is in fact the first place that I reviewed for. I think the first review that I wrote was actually of David Winner's Cannibal of Guadalajara, and he's now my co-editor at Satiric magazine. So it's very, very interesting to see how many years have passed since then. But I'm coming from a very different background. I come from the visual arts, and I found myself in a very uncomfortable position of changing, let's say, career midstream and beginning again at zero. And in a way, my approach to book review in the beginning was, can I really do this? Am I allowed to do this? And John Reed, your predecessor, gave me the chance to do that. And I very, very quickly discovered that I loved it, and that it was for me a way of understanding my own analytical skills, I suppose, and applying that to my own writing. And also very, very deeply, I think I feel a very deep commitment to the idea of giving back, of being a very good literary citizen and being part of a community and doing work that, again, none of us are really paid for in any way. But over the years, criticism has taken on a very central role in my writing life. I do a little bit less of it at the moment because I'm doing so much editing on the magazine, but it's not going to go away. It's a way of engaging with a larger discussion. And I think also as an American, I mean, I grew up in New York, but I've been in Europe more than half my life. I live in Germany. I make my money as a translator, actually, of art theory and art criticism. And I see myself as a kind of a hinge between cultures. So some of the work that I did write about was German language work translated into English. I just recently reviewed the beautiful Susan Bernofsky biography of Robert Walser for the American Scholar. And so I see myself sort of occupying a unique position between languages and between cultures. And I feel like I can mediate and make certain things intelligible that maybe otherwise wouldn't be. I mean, apart from the obvious fact that European literature doesn't get a lot of traction in the United States, but this is an entirely different discussion that I don't think I need to get into at the moment. But I mean, the rail has, you also, I remember, do you remember the interview that I did with Mui Pupapsako and the Thai writer Duanwat Pimwana? I don't know if I would have been able to place. I mean, Pinwana is one of the most well-known contemporary Thai writers writing today, and nobody knows her really. And it was a virtual literary sensation that this first book of hers came out in this excellent translation. And I can't think of too many more places than the Brooklyn Rail that would publish such an important review that's actually that has almost no place in, let's say, a commercial reviewing culture. It would never wind up in a larger venue. And so I think that the Rail really does occupy a key role in that sense. And so I'm just really, really happy and sometimes kind of really proud to be.
No, I'm grateful for that in a way. I'm grateful and I'm not grateful because that answer is so full, and so many of these answers are so full that they tip the balance on what I originally had planned to ask you next. But I'm going to try to cobble it together in a way more articulate than I was in my introductions. Again, I apologize for that. But John talked about an interest in having his reviews have an impact on the culture, moving the culture a bit, and talked about this being a golden age, in fact. Yvonne talked about one of the reasons she enjoys reviewing is because she gets to bring to our attention underrepresented voices. And that is part of the reason she does this. Tony talked about being a lover of books, right? Just enjoying books as an object and as a thing to engage with and wanting to share that joy and that enthusiasm with readers. And Tanjil, as we just discussed, has a history of reading at home, the newspaper brought into the house, but also as a trained critic and balancing all those interests and abilities. And we just heard from Andrea talking about the various voices that are able to be brought to readers as a book critic. And we're so happy to do that in the Rail. But I guess it brings me to the question I really wanted to ask, and I think is such an important one. If we think of this as a golden age, as John said, and I think a little bit about sort of the lovely way that Tanjil was articulating the ideas of being an actual critic, trained to think of the book review as I do, as whenever I've worked with you folks, as, as a form of critical analysis, as an argument, making an argument with and supported by, if not evidence, then quotes from the book, and then considering also the language, tone, and style of the presentation, the rhetorical approaches that a writer takes, and how we address that rhetorically as reviewers. Is there an echo chamber? Do we kind of come in on that? In what ways? I loved when Yvonne talked about the way the Rail and her other venues shape the way she writes. That she talked about shaping it. And that talks about a lot of sort of conscious crafting of sentences within the review. And so there's all these agile abilities we have as critics to engage with books. And yet, if it is a golden age and there is such ubiquity of reviews, I have so many emails every day from publicists, writers, editors, agents. There's so many people that want their books covered, right? And those same reviewers, and I follow them just as I follow all of you. I'm always delighted when Tanjil posts a new book review. As he said, they're entertaining and erudite, and it's wonderful. But I look at I often check out the writers who are pitching me, trying to figure out how I'm going to fill up my little space each month in the Rail. And I'm amazed sometimes when I see these writers so self-promotional, saying, hey, look, just get on Amazon. You don't even have to write a review. Just give me 5 stars. And then book reads. And some of the book reads reviews are amazing. I love reading Roxane Gay's reviews on Goodreads. But so often Amazon becomes a place for customer evaluations of a book, and the idea of really digging in. And Goodreads, of course, is wonderful, but to some extent they're amateurs. They are amateurs. They haven't been doing this for a long time, perhaps, and you can feel that tension a little bit in the reviews. I guess with all of this surrounding us, my question is, with the lack of pay and the hustling you have to do to get into these pages, what are book reviews for in the culture? What service do they provide? What are they doing for the culture? How are they moving the culture forward, as John says? All of you in many ways. I mean, Yvonne touched on it fairly specifically, but you know what? Maybe I'll start with our last speaker and ask Andrea to kind of come in on, you were talking about the culture a little bit. What is the purpose of book reviewing now for the culture? Yeah.
To be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure, but what I do feel very, very strongly as a reviewer is that, I mean, I'm not exactly sure who it was, somebody brought up the question of the negative review. And I think I've only done this once or twice, and I discovered rather quickly that this is not something that I'm interested in doing, that I really don't want to do this again. This is an entire discussion, maybe for another time. But I see my main interest in trying to analyze a piece of writing, not only thematically and in terms of the culture, but also formally, because I think to a certain extent, I don't even mean craft when I say formally. I think that so much of the magic and the hard work and the incredible sleight of hand that go into creating a really, really well-formed book, where you don't see the seams, and I think it's probably my main interest is a formal interest in literature, to see what people are doing with the actual form. And I don't see a lot of this kind of analysis taking place anymore, you know, and so I'm actually probably personally more interested in getting into the nitty-gritty about how a book operates really on its own terms. And this is maybe the phrase that I would like to underline, is a book operates on its own terms, and to discover what those terms are and basically show the book enough respect to try to understand it on its own terms. This is maybe for me more pressing and urgent than asking myself the question of how it speaks to the culture, because I think that readers are out there and they're going to search out what they're interested in. And if I write something that rings a bell with somebody, then of course I'm very, very happy, but I don't think of the cultural function of a review when I'm writing a review.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the text for its own sake, almost a kind of new critical approach, right? Structuralism, taking it. This is wonderful. Tanjil, how do you see it?
Yeah, I actually find myself agreeing quite a lot with what Andrea just said. I mean, I'm really interested in form and what writers are doing, you know, how they're producing the sort of effects they are, but where I would somewhat disagree is that I think, you know, what a writer is doing with form is also related to the wider culture as well. So really,
how so, Tanjil?
So I think that really there's no such thing as a sort of pure form, really. You know, every form of writing is a kind of engagement with the world in some way, and sometimes, you know, form is, for instance, you know, the rise in autofiction, for instance. I mean, that is one particular kind of form that we're seeing quite a lot, and that is undoubtedly related to certain developments, you know, in the culture. This sort of inward turn, this sort of preoccupation with the self, and so sort of form and culture are sort of very closely related. But yeah, on the whole, I mean, that's, you know, if I have an approach, which I don't think I really do, it is to focus on the form, and to, I mean, I think it was Samuel Johnson who said something about the purpose of criticism being to improve, to improve opinion into knowledge. And so I think there's a sort of a job for the critic to kind of identify the sort of feeling that you might have while the mysterious sensation of reading, and trying to sort of approach that more rigorously, and trying to figure out what actually is going on, and trying to explain what readers sort of may already sense, but to give it some more sort of grounding and significance.
Tony, I want to sort of build off of that. When you talked about your love of books and your enthusiasm, you mentioned my interest in your book of interviews with poets. It felt very much like Paris Review interviews, right, where craft was so forefront in the discussion, how poems are built, how writers are engaging with their drafts. So there's such knowledge behind how you treat books, and yet there's all this joy and enthusiasm. How do you think about the sort of the cultural implications, and do you agree that we can turn this kind of to sort of the opinion into knowledge, the enthusiasm into critical close readings. Talk a little bit about all of this.
I'm not sure how much I can say about it. I will say that what Andrea had mentioned, I could pretty much carbon copy that and say that I agree exactly with what she was saying. I also think that had each of us gotten an hour, she probably would have gotten to a very similar place that Tanjil got to, which is that we all know that forms in themselves are not pure forms, right? That they're somehow representative of cultural ideologies and so forth. I mean, like, you know, the idea that the sonnet, the pure or that the strict sonnet form for a while was being considered fascist, and yet then, you know, now we see some of the most exciting and open and equitable books of the last several years have been sonnet sequences.
Yeah.
And how that form has exploded, and that's in response to the cultural discussions that are going on as well. For me, though, I mean, I think, you know, I am a visual artist as well, and I've always had an interest in building things, although I'm really bad with house stuff. So, I mean, I can't, you know, I can't sit there and fix my leaking roof, but what I can do is build up or break down bits of writing and things like that and see how something is made. And that's really important to me. I do that with artwork as well. Our process is very, very intriguing to me. And I think that though you can't separate that from cultural discussions. But for me, it really is about loving to discuss how something or how I think something was made, or how, you know, how I'm getting at its construction. You can't separate these things from other concerns, obviously. But I would need to, in order, I guess, to answer your question as well as you framed it, would be I would need to deal with a specific book.
Yeah.
To do that. I will say though that I also want to echo something that Andrea said earlier about the Rail being able to put into reviews things that wouldn't get a home elsewhere. And one of I'm very committed to European, specifically European, but elsewhere, European poetry that is not originally written in English. And one of the favorite reviews, and I felt it was a gift that you were able to take it, was the Per Ott Brandt review, the Danish poet, which and you let me go long, and I'm like, where else would I be able to present this? And so I felt privileged to be able to talk about that, and also thankful that someone translated it because I don't know Danish.
More to come on some of the things you just touched on, but for the sake of thank you, Tony. For the sake of time, I'm going to go to Yvonne. Yvonne, you talked a little bit about the culture in your first response. Can you build on that a little bit, or maybe on some of the things you're hearing right now?
Yeah, you know, first I'm going to be sort of the ornery union shop steward in the room, because as my day job, and Tanjil, you referred to this idea of, you know, we write for pleasure, we write, you know, not, as Harlan Ellison suggested years ago, always get paid, but we're writing to be a part of the cultural conversation. And I would like to push back. You know, I also have a day job that has nothing whatsoever to do with literature, or quite frankly, with art, and, you know, arguably whether or not it's part of the culture, larger cultural conversation. I really think that we need to put a different lens on this idea of the golden age of book reviewing. There are a lot of outlets, just as there were in the 70s and 80s with fanzines, you know, and the rise of, and I could go on for hours about this, but the rise of, you know, easy and cheap duplicating. But whose voices are we hearing? And, you know, what do we mean when we say amateur versus, you know, expert?
That's me, yeah.
And who are the experts who are actually getting paid to do this for a living? Is it a smaller and smaller group of non-marginal voices? You know, who gets paid to write those big reviews, and the outlets that pay you enough so that you can make a living at this? I mean, I think we do need to look at the fact that, you know, if you want to be an artist, particularly in this country, in the United States, it's nearly impossible as anyone who is in a marginalized group of people to do that without having a day job. And particularly if you live in one of the supposed cultural centers like San Francisco or Seattle or New York or et cetera, how do you afford to live and do the work that you do? I think, yes, I want to very much be part of the larger cultural conversation. And I do want to really give Brooklyn Rail props for giving me the space to speak, because that's something that, Joe is an editor, very seldom, I think I can count on one hand the times we've argued over a review. And I will embrace a book that I don't like, because I want to know why I don't like it. That's kind of, again, coming out of a dissertation process. One of the first lines in my dissertation was quoting a very famous rock critic who wrote about male-centered punk rock in the 80s. And I gave the quote and I said, the problem, he's saying this, the problem is that he's wrong. Now I had to remove that from the dissertation because in the academic process, it's a parallel conversation. In the pages of the Rail, I'm not interested in the parallel conversation. I'm interested in directly confronting why there are certain accepted writers who every book they put out, whether it's good or crap, that we're supposed to embrace it. That it's quite often the same people who get reviewed over and over in the New York Times, the LA Times Book Review. If I want to see a lengthy, challenging book review, I'm going to read the Rail. I'm going to read, someone like Gina Arnold writing online for no money because she can no longer get paid as a critic. There just isn't any money in it. Goodreads reviews are interesting. And when I'm really bored during the day job, sometimes I'll be writing on Amazon. I'll review my friends' books on Amazon. But this idea that everybody's a critic really appeals to the punk rocker in me. But even in the punk rock scene, there was a level of being an expert. You knew everything about all the music. You knew who the players were. You knew how to approach things with, we would have rejected this idea of you go to school and learn how to do this because you didn't. You learned it from the culture and the cultural conversation. And I think that what we are all doing here, in a sense, is being part of, an expanded scene, and not an exclusive one, but a much more open conversation. And it's a conversation that's not happening in a lot of the outlets where you get paid for your work. And I don't want to sound mercenary, but I am a socialist. People deserve to get paid for their work. And the idea that a review on Goodreads or on Amazon is the same as a review that someone who is an expert in their field, who comes with a great level of sensitivity that you're seeing in what Tony and John and Tanjil and Andrea are saying about art. And writing is art. And I'm sorry if I'm getting really passionate here, but I care deeply about both about the books that come out, but also about the process of thinking about those books. And, it's not just a matter of honoring my own education or all of your educations. We're not elitist in the sense that you have to have the PhD in order to write the book review. That's bullshit as far as I'm concerned. But we give a level of attention. And when Tony's talking about Danish poetry, listen to what he's saying. Listen to what we're talking about, because you can't just pick up a book. And I'm going to use Dan Brown because he's my favorite writer to loathe. But, one of the most brilliant acts of criticism I ever saw was years ago at Tin House Workshops. Anthony Doerr gave a very active lecture to a large room full of people, and he MFA'd the shit out of Dan Brown. The first page. It was
the literary offenses of Dan Brown.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
And it was I think what a lot of us do. It's a part of the conversation. So I'm going on a long time.
No, you're good. And I'm going to jump to John in a second. And if Tanjil wanted to come in on any of that, but you mentioned something that we don't have a lot of time for, maybe a part 2 of this. I hope you'll all come back. But when a critic can do not so much a negative review, but can really show how a book works, whether positively or negatively, it's an astounding, entertaining feat. I mean, it's a kind of intellection that I think only the book review or book criticism does well. I remember the delicious pleasure of reading Martin Amos's review of Hannibal. And Amos begins by saying something like, to start this review, he sat back and cracked his knuckles in delight at how he was going to set upon the new Harris book. But when you read it, it's not an easy he does a very thorough job of explaining. He said, you may like this book, but I'm going to explain to you why this is not literature, exactly why this is not literature. And it's a fascinating take on it. I want to leave open some space here, but John, did you have any final thoughts kind of about this idea of the cultural relationship in our book reviewing job?
Well, first, thanks and hats off to everyone. Yeah, wow. It is an enormous subject. I am generally on the side, I can make two general points. I'm generally on the side of finding where a book is located in the culture as part of defining its craft, its how it operates on its own. I can say that I published 2 long essays on that, one about American postmodern or experimental fiction called Against the Impossible to Explain, which argued that postmodern fiction, experimental fiction, which is thought of blindly as being art for its own sake, divorced from reality, is in fact the fiction that best engages reality. And I used examples. The one that comes to mind immediately is Steve Henriksen, but then Carol Mazo would be another. But then more recently in LitHub, maybe somebody here saw it, I had a long piece on refugee fiction and literature, looked at the fiction and stories out of a number of refugee cultures, starting with Khaled Khalifa, ending with Hernandez, Mexican in the US. The argument was, again, something about the value of the books themselves, but how they illuminated our culture of the moment. A lot of other stuff to cover here. I would only underscore that I feel in the rail there's a tremendous opportunity to both consider what's in a book and where it is located in the culture at the moment. My upcoming one is probably going to be something Yvonne will vomit just to hear of, but I'm going to actually review the next Richard Powers. I guess I can say that. And it would be wrong of me not to review the book without considering his place in the culture and how Overstory seems to have carried his reputation to a new level of wide appeal and even impact, one hopes. It's essential to the review. A lot else I can say. I hope that helps. I will add that you've always let me say bad things about books when I felt it. I don't think I've published a piece in the rail that didn't have reservations here or there.
Yeah,
okay.
I was just going to say, not bad so much as critical and reserved. John, and I'm going to conclude our conversation. This will be our last sort of question here, and then I'm going to bring Sophia back to share a poem with us in closing, as is the tradition here. But finally, and perhaps everybody could just jump in as they will, no particular order. I'm thinking, sort of a nice place to end up might be about the future of criticism, giving sort of some of the things we thought about today. The future of criticism, book criticism in our culture. What do you think about it? Just a quick kind of.
I'll jump in really quickly, and then I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say. And maybe it's because I took the red eye and I watched Promising Young Woman on the plane instead of sleeping. Yeah, I want to be optimistic. I do, but I think that as our culture continues to move away from paying artists for their work, it's going to be very difficult to attract intelligent, skilled writers to the field of book criticism when it almost feels like the few remaining outlets And let's be clear, newspapers are directly under attack. They're, when we talk about the golden age, I think about, the 1980s when every single market, at least for a touring band, had a local newspaper, and that local newspaper reviewed books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the AP Wire book review. So what is the future? I mean, I think it's morphing, but I think there's going to have to be some kind of equity, some kind of give to the critics who do the hard work in order for us to survive, because it becomes not just unequitable, but it's a losing proposition to be a book critic if you're putting stuff out on Substack and you don't get paid for it. I think that's a terrible transactional way to view book criticism, but that's also a reality that a lot of us live under.
A reality David Byrne subscribes to. I'm sure you've heard what he says, that, why do we assume artists are going to be artists whether they get paid or not? They're going to be less artists. They're going to give it less time. I can't predict the future. The larger issue is, does culture continue? All of us must work to that. The book itself may no longer be it's certainly lost prestige in our culture, and we may see something else come along to replace the book, as first the movies did, and then TV, or the TV narrative has, etc. Let's hear from others.
That's actually the only point where I really am optimistic, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think I'm pessimistic about almost everything, if I'm really honest with myself and with all of you. But about I'm in a early 18th century stone house, not actually at the moment because our internet doesn't work, but down in the valley. I'm in a Swiss valley, and we've been out of whatever, but I'm sort of living in a different century at the moment. And what I keep finding are these 300, 400, 500, 600-year-old books just laying around. I think the book is a unique, erratic object, and I think that it exerts magic, and it has a power. I don't think that's going to go away. I mean, I don't know how it is there as much. I mean, I know the situation a little bit better in Germany, to be honest, but during the entire Corona period, where we all thought that the business was going to collapse in on itself, my publisher did better than she had in the last couple of years. I mean, people are buying a lot of books, and I think the book will survive. That's my feeling. Everything else will go down the drain. No.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll give Andrea the last word there. Thanks all of you for today's conversation. John, Yvonne, Tony, Tanjil, Andrea, thank you so much. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And so I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Sophia Pedlow. She's the managing director of the Brooklyn Rail, and I'd like to welcome her to the stage to share a poem with us today.
Thank you both. Thank you all so much for this conversation. And I am thrilled to be reading from the July-August issue, which just arrived at our headquarters today. And the poem I'm reading is called How to Get Water by Laura Henriksen. It would be easy to mistake the desert for a grave, but the desert is the ocean, and the ocean is a grave. If you must grow, grow slowly. See if time makes you sturdy. If a four-wheeler can pass you over like a breeze through a mariner's hair. I walk to the bow to do my little shake silently from laughing routine. I listen to your music and pretend it's mine. Or that we are together and the same. The glass is in your hand, the glass is in mine. The glass is across the street at a party, talking with girls about animals they've known or wish to. The sky is about to break and destroy the tiger, orange balloon that escaped its festival and now rolls fugitive along the street. I never asked for this or for money or for the sun in its relentless splendor to chase us down each day, jealous of our sports teams and love and fancy cocktails and the way mortality makes them taste more minerally and sweet. I could devise a test, and the test could generate a map, and the map could us deliver to the armory of dead letters, and the letters could form a code that will waste what's left of my life in struggle to decipher. And then one day, my granddaughter, smoking a cigarette with her gills, could finally see the system, drop her cigarette in disbelief, and it would embering roll like a ball to the sea.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for everything that you do for the Rail, and for sharing it with the world today.
Thank you, Sophia. And thanks to all of you guests for being part of this wonderful conversation. It could go on so much further, and I hope we'll get a chance to do it again, maybe next time in person. Thanks, Sophia, Nick, Fong, Charlie, everybody at the Rail. And thanks to all of you who are watching on our YouTube channel. Please check out our events page at the Brooklyn Rail for more of these events. And thanks, everybody, for coming and being part of this. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.